For 11 years, Maya Thompson waited. She held her family together through impossible circumstances, raising 3 children alone while her husband, Jarrell, served time in prison. It wasn't easy, but Maya believed in love. She believed in second chances. And when the gates of that prison finally opened, Maya thought the sacrifices she made had been worth it. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that the man she had waited for wasn't the same man who had walked through those gates. There was a secret, one he had carried with him, hidden behind his smile and the promises of a fresh start. A secret so devastating that it would change Maya's life forever. Soon, strange things began to happen. Maya, who had always been the pillar of strength, started feeling weak. Exhausted. Sick. At first, she dismissed it, she was just tired, she thought, from years of struggle. But the truth was something much more unsettling. And when it finally came to light, it wasn't just Maya's health at risk. It was her trust. Her hope. Her very identity. What do you do when the person you've sacrificed everything for betrays you in the worst way imaginable? How far would you go for justice, or for revenge? This is the story of Maya and Jarrell Thompson, a tale of love, loyalty, and betrayal that ends in an act so shocking, it left an entire community in disbelief. But the question remains, was this the only way? The answers lie in the next chapters of this story, but before we go deep to uncover the chilling details of what led Jarrell to prison and his life there, the decision he made and the consequences of the decision, we would like to welcome you to our channel, True Crime Zone HQ. Thank you to all our viewers and a special shout out to our subscribers for your continued support. Together, we strive to improve and bring you daily updates on both told and untold true crime stories. Please don't forget to click the subscribe button if you haven't. Now, let's start. In the heart of Chicago's South Side, where the hum of traffic and the distant wail of sirens was as constant as the rhythm of life, Maya and Jarrell Thompson carved out a love story that defied the odds. Their beginnings weren't glamorous or smooth, but they were real, grounded in resilience and hope that things could be better. Jarrell grew up in a household shaped by absence. His father, a shadowy figure from his earliest memories, walked out when Jarrell was just a boy, leaving his mother, Denise, to hold everything together. She worked long hours, scrubbing floors in high-rise offices and cleaning houses that seemed a world apart from their own tiny apartment. Denise was relentless, but even she couldn't shield her children from the realities of their environment. Jarrell was the oldest, and with that came responsibility. By the time he was 10, he was already walking his younger siblings to school, cooking simple meals, and finding ways to stretch what little they had. His childhood disappeared in the cracks of duty, but his determination to help his family never wavered. Even as he grew older, it was clear that Jarrell carried a quiet strength. Teachers often remarked on his sharp mind, particularly his gift for math. They said he could have a bright future. But dreams in Jarrell's world were often crushed under the weight of bills, empty fridges, and the fear of eviction notices. Maya's world, while not without its challenges, was different. She was the daughter of 2 educators who believed fiercely in the power of knowledge and faith. Her childhood home was filled with books, prayers, and conversations about how to leave the world better than you found it. Maya absorbed it all, and by the time she was in high school, she had a vision for her life. She wanted to teach. She wanted to inspire. And she wanted to make sure that no child ever felt like the world had already given up on them. When Maya and Jarrell met, their worlds collided in an unexpected but beautiful way. It was at a community book drive, an event where Maya had volunteered to read to children and Jarrell had come to pick up free books for his younger siblings. The two exchanged glances across the room, and what began as a shy conversation quickly blossomed into something more. Maya saw beyond Jarrell's struggles. She saw his heart, his loyalty, and his unwavering determination to keep moving forward no matter how many obstacles stood in his way. Jarrell admired Maya's drive, her kindness, and the way she could light up any room she walked into. She became a source of inspiration for him, a reminder that there was more to life than survival. Their love grew quickly, and soon enough, they were inseparable. They didn't have much, a small apartment, hand-me-down furniture, and paychecks that barely stretched to the end of the month, but they had each other. And for a while, that was enough. When their first child, Zion, was born, Jarrell and Maya cried tears of both joy and fear. They wanted to give their son a life better than the one they had known. Maya worked as a teacher, often picking up extra hours tutoring to make ends meet. Jarrell took on backbreaking jobs, working in warehouses, cleaning offices, and doing whatever he could to provide. The couple welcomed 2 more children, Leah and Malik, and their tiny apartment was soon filled with laughter and love, but also with quiet nights of worry. The weight of being a provider began to take its toll on Jarrell. The long hours, the rejection from better-paying jobs, and the ever-growing pile of bills left him feeling like he was failing the family he loved so deeply. Maya, ever the optimist, tried to remind him of the bigger picture. "We'll get through this," she would say, her voice steady and reassuring. But for Jarrell, the strain was becoming too much to bear. As Maya tried to stretch her salary to cover bills and groceries, Jarrell felt the walls closing in around him. The weight of their struggles wasn't just financial, it was emotional. He saw the exhaustion etched into Maya's face every night and heard the muffled questions from Zion, their oldest, about why they couldn't have the same things other kids had. Jarrell's pride began to twist into guilt, and guilt turned into desperation. Deshawn's arrival seemed almost fated. The neighborhood was full of men like him, charismatic, confident, and with pockets that always seemed lined with cash. Deshawn wasn't a stranger to Jarrell, they had played on the same streets as kids, back when life was simpler. But now, Deshawn's life seemed like a world apart. He wore expensive sneakers, drove a car that gleamed under the streetlights, and always seemed to know the right things to say. When Deshawn sat down beside Jarrell that day, he didn't mince words. "Look, man," he began, his voice low and steady. "I know you're doing your best for your family. But sometimes, you gotta take shortcuts if you want to make it out of this." He pulled a thick wad of cash from his pocket, letting it rest in his hand just long enough for Jarrell to notice. "This could be yours. One job. No hassle. Just one." Jarrell hesitated. He knew Deshawn wasn't the type to get involved in anything legal, and yet the offer gnawed at him. He thought about Maya, who had been skipping meals to save money. He thought about the pair of shoes Zion needed for school, the ones Jarrell had promised to buy but couldn't afford. Deshawn's words echoed in his mind, louder than his own doubts. One job, he told himself. Just this once. That night, Jarrell found himself in an alleyway, the cold biting through his thin jacket. The package in his hands felt heavier than it should have, and every passing car made his heart race. He told himself it would all be over soon, just a simple drop-off, and then he could go back to his family with enough money to buy a week's worth of groceries. But life rarely goes according to plan. The sirens came first, slicing through the quiet night like a knife. Then, the blinding flash of red and blue lights. Jarrell froze, the package still in his hands, as officers surrounded him. The arrest was swift, and by the time he was sitting in the back of the police car, Jarrell already knew he had made a mistake he couldn't undo. The courtroom was a cold and unforgiving place. The prosecutor painted Jarrell as another statistic, a man who had chosen the wrong path. Jarrell wanted to explain, to tell them that he was just trying to feed his family, but the words felt hollow even to him. The judge, unmoved by his pleas, handed down a 15-year sentence. Jarrell barely heard the gavel strike as the weight of the verdict settled over him. 15 years. He would miss birthdays, graduations, and moments he could never get back. Maya, sitting in the back of the courtroom, clutched her hands tightly. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She knew she had to be strong, for their children, for herself, and even for Jarrell. As the guards led him away, she whispered a silent prayer, vowing to hold the family together no matter what. The weeks after Jarrell's sentencing were some of the hardest of Maya's life. She worked late into the night, grading papers and tutoring students to bring in extra income. She learned how to stretch $1 in ways she never thought possible, and when her children asked about their father, she told them the truth without bitterness. "Your dad made a mistake," she would say. "But we still love him, and he loves us." The gates of the prison closed behind Jarrell with a sound he would never forget. It was the sound of finality, of a world left behind. The intake process was dehumanizing, stripped of his belongings, his clothes, and even his name. In this place, he wasn't Jarrell Thompson. He was a number, a face in a crowd of men who had all made their own desperate choices. At 28, Jarrell was younger than many of the inmates, and his slight build made him stand out. Prison was a world of its own, with rules that weren't written but enforced with brutal precision. Respect was everything, and weakness was a beacon for trouble. Jarrell quickly learned to keep his head down and avoid eye contact, but even that wasn't enough to shield him from the dangers around every corner. The first few weeks were the hardest. Fights broke out over trivial things, someone taking too long at the phone, a glance that lingered too long, or a misplaced word. Jarrell tried to stay out of the chaos, but isolation came with its own risks. In a place like this, being alone made you an easy target. Jarrell cycled through several cellmates in his first year, each one leaving an impression. There was Marcus, who barely spoke but had a quiet rage simmering beneath the surface. Then there was Tyrone, who spent most of his time reading books about self-improvement. But it wasn't until King became his cellmate that Jarrell's life in prison took a drastic turn. Jarrell thought he understood survival. He had spent his life navigating struggle, growing up in a home where sacrifice was as common as the air they breathed. But nothing had prepared him for the rules of survival in prison, a place where vulnerability was a dangerous liability and alliances were often forged out of necessity, not trust. It was during Jarrell's second year behind bars that he was assigned a new cellmate, a man everyone in the prison referred to as King. The name wasn't just a nickname, it was a title. King's reputation was undeniable. He wasn't the loudest or the most violent, but his authority was absolute. He was a large, imposing man with a demeanor that commanded attention, and his influence extended far beyond the four walls of their shared cell. King was known for his control over the prison's unofficial economy. He could get things, favors, protection, even luxuries that seemed impossible in a place like this. Other inmates knew better than to cross him, and those who did rarely made the same mistake twice. For many, including Jarrell, King represented both a threat and an opportunity. When Jarrell first met King, the tension was immediate. In the world outside, they would have been strangers, men with little in common. But inside the prison, King saw something in Jarrell, a young, unguarded man who was struggling to adapt, someone who could be useful if placed under the right kind of pressure. And for Jarrell, King represented a chance to find safety in a place where danger seemed to lurk around every corner. The arrangement began with unspoken rules. King offered Jarrell protection, ensuring that he wasn't targeted during the chaotic moments that defined prison life, fights in the yard, stolen meals, and the ever-present threat of violence. In return, Jarrell became part of King's circle. At first, it was small tasks, delivering messages, keeping an eye on certain inmates. But as the months went on, the lines of their relationship began to blur. King's dominance was undeniable, and his interest in Jarrell became increasingly personal. For Jarrell, the choices he faced were anything but easy. Prison had stripped him of control over nearly every aspect of his life, and in King, he found a source of stability, even if that stability came at a cost. King offered him not just protection but access to things that made prison life bearable: food, cigarettes, and, most importantly, drugs. Jarrell had never been a stranger to substance use. Before his arrest, it had been an escape from the stress of his daily life. In prison, it became something more, a way to dull the constant edge of fear and regret that defined his days. King was his supplier, but their arrangement wasn't one-sided. As the power dynamics shifted, their relationship crossed boundaries that Jarrell would later struggle to reconcile. Behind the locked doors of their cell, the reality of their arrangement was clear. King had what Jarrell needed: protection, access, and a sense of belonging in a place that often felt like a battlefield. And in return, Jarrell gave King what he wanted. It wasn't a relationship built on love or even mutual respect. It was an exchange, one born out of necessity and survival. But survival often comes with unseen risks. What Jarrell didn't know, what King had kept hidden, was that King was HIV positive. In the outside world, this knowledge would have been a warning, a chance to make informed decisions. But in prison, where secrets were currency and truth was often a liability, it was a danger Jarrell never saw coming. Back home, Maya continued to write letters to Jarrell, her words filled with hope and devotion. She told him about the children's milestones, Zion's growing curiosity, Leia's talent for drawing, Malik's infectious laughter. Her letters were a lifeline, a way to remind Jarrell of the family that was waiting for him beyond the prison gates. Jarrell wrote back, but his letters painted a picture far removed from the reality of his life behind bars. He spoke of redemption, of using his time in prison to reflect and grow. He told Maya that he was counting down the days until he could hold her again, until he could be the husband and father they all deserved. To Maya, the man in those letters was strong, hopeful, and determined. But the truth was far more complicated. Every time Jarrell sat down to write, he felt the weight of the secrets he carried. How could he tell Maya about the choices he had made? How could he explain the compromises, the things he had done to survive? He convinced himself that silence was better, that by protecting Maya from the truth, he was shielding her from the pain that came with it. And so, he buried it all, writing words that felt more like fiction with every passing year. But silence has its own consequences. As Jarrell read Maya's letters, filled with love and optimism, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of guilt. He had made promises to her, promises that now felt impossible to keep. He wanted to believe that when his sentence ended, they could pick up where they left off. But deep down, he knew that the life he had built with Maya was slipping further and further away. By the time Jarrell reached the halfway point of his sentence, he had become a man divided. To his family, he was a devoted husband and father, counting down the days until their reunion. To King and the other inmates, he was a survivor, someone who had learned how to navigate the unspoken rules of prison life. And to himself, he was a man haunted by choices he couldn't undo and secrets he couldn't share. After 11 long years, the day Maya had waited for finally arrived. The sun shone brightly on the morning Jarrell walked out of those prison gates, a free man for the first time in over a decade. Maya stood there with their 3 children, her heart pounding as she caught sight of him. He looked older, his face lined with the weight of years spent behind bars, but to her, he was still Jarrell, the man she had vowed to stand by, no matter what. As Jarrell stepped closer, his children ran to him. Zion, now a teenager, was nearly as tall as his father and wrapped him in a hug that spoke of years of missed moments. Leia, now 12, hesitated for only a moment before running to his side, her eyes glistening with emotion. And Malik, the youngest, who had been just a toddler when Jarrell was taken away, clung to his father as if afraid he might disappear again. Maya hung back, watching the reunion unfold, tears streaming down her face. This was the moment she had dreamed of, their family, finally together again. But even as they embraced, there was a sense of distance, an unspoken tension that neither Jarrell nor Maya could ignore. The years apart had changed them both in ways they couldn't yet put into words. As they drove home, the children chatted excitedly, filling the car with stories about school, friends, and the little moments Jarrell had missed. Maya sat in the driver's seat, glancing at Jarrell in the rearview mirror. He smiled at the kids, but his eyes held something she couldn't quite place, a heaviness that refused to fade. When they reached the small house Maya had worked so hard to maintain, Jarrell paused at the doorway. He took a deep breath, as if trying to absorb the life he had left behind. Inside, the walls were filled with family photos, the ones Maya had clung to during his absence. The kids showed him their rooms, each one eager to share their world with the father they had longed for. But Maya noticed the way Jarrell's gaze lingered on certain things, the worn furniture, the patched-up roof, the faint marks on the walls where years of wear had taken their toll. This wasn't the home he remembered, and he wasn't the same man who had left it. The first few weeks of Jarrell's return were filled with moments of joy and hope. The family ate dinner together every night, sharing stories and laughter as if trying to make up for lost time. Maya cherished those evenings, even as she noticed Jarrell's growing restlessness. He struggled to find his place in a world that had moved on without him. The job market was unforgiving, and his criminal record loomed over every interview like a shadow. At first, Jarrell approached his job search with determination. He woke up early, dressed neatly, and spent hours filling out applications. But rejection after rejection began to wear on him. Employers barely glanced at his resume before dismissing him. "We'll call you," they would say, but the phone never rang. Each rejection felt like a reminder of everything he had lost, and slowly, that determination turned into frustration. Maya watched as Jarrell withdrew into himself. He spent hours staring out the window, lost in thought. When the kids asked him to play or help with their homework, he would force a smile and join them, but the spark in his eyes was gone. Maya tried to encourage him, reminding him that it would take time to adjust, but even she couldn't ignore the toll it was taking on both of them. The financial burden of supporting the family fell squarely on her shoulders, and though she never complained, the strain was beginning to show. The tension between them grew, unspoken but undeniable. Maya had spent years holding the family together, and now that Jarrell was back, she had hoped to share the load. But instead, it felt as though the weight had doubled. Jarrell's frustration often turned inward, manifesting as self-doubt and guilt. He wanted to provide for his family, but the barriers in his way felt insurmountable. And Maya, despite her best efforts to remain patient and supportive, found herself growing resentful of the man who had once been her partner in every sense of the word. Maya Thompson had always been a woman of strength. Her resilience had carried her through years of hardship, from the financial struggles of raising 3 children on her own to the emotional toll of being separated from her husband. She had endured it all, and through it, she had remained steadfast. But now, for the first time, she felt as though her body was betraying her. It started innocently enough. Maya would wake up feeling tired, even after a full night's sleep. She chalked it up to stress. After all, she was still working long hours, managing the household, and trying to help Jarrell adjust to life outside of prison. "I just need to rest more," she told herself, brushing off the fatigue as something that would pass with time. But the fatigue didn't pass. In fact, it worsened. Simple tasks that had once been second nature, walking up the stairs, carrying groceries, playing with her children, began to feel like monumental challenges. Her joints ached in ways they never had before, a dull, persistent pain that seemed to settle into her very bones. She found herself reaching for over-the-counter pain relievers more often, but even they provided little relief. Maya began to notice other symptoms too, ones that were harder to ignore. She would wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, her body trembling as if it were fighting a battle she couldn't understand. Her appetite dwindled, and she started losing weight without trying. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The vibrant woman she once was seemed to be fading before her own eyes. Despite all of this, Maya tried to push through. She couldn't afford to slow down, not with bills to pay and children to care for. She told herself it was just stress, that her body was simply reacting to the years of pressure she had been under. But in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that something wasn't right. That voice grew louder with each passing day, until it became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, while teaching a class, Maya felt a wave of dizziness so intense that she had to grip the edge of her desk to steady herself. The room seemed to spin around her, the voices of her students fading into a distant hum. When the episode passed, she excused herself to the restroom, splashing cold water on her face in an attempt to regain her composure. But as she stared at her reflection in the mirror, she knew she couldn't keep pretending. Something was wrong, and she needed answers. It took days for Maya to summon the courage to make a doctor's appointment. Part of her was afraid of what she might find out, while another part of her clung to the hope that it was something minor, an iron deficiency, maybe, or the lingering effects of stress. When she finally sat in the sterile, fluorescent-lit office, her heart raced as the doctor asked her a series of routine questions. How long had she been experiencing symptoms? Had there been any changes in her lifestyle? Was there any chance she had been exposed to an illness? The blood work was drawn quickly, and Maya left the clinic feeling a mix of anxiety and relief. At least now, she would have answers. But when the call came a few days later, her heart sank as the nurse on the other end of the line asked her to come back in for a follow-up appointment. "We need to go over your test results," the nurse said, her tone calm but professional. Maya's mind raced with possibilities as she scheduled the visit, each one more worrying than the last. When the day of the follow-up appointment arrived, Maya found herself sitting alone in the waiting room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She barely noticed the muted television in the corner or the other patients around her. All she could focus on was the weight in her chest, the nagging sense that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The doctor entered the room with a folder in hand, his expression serious but not unkind. He sat across from her, opening the folder and glancing at the papers inside before meeting her eyes. "Maya," he began, his voice measured, "we've received your test results, and I need to share some difficult news with you." Maya's stomach tightened as she braced herself. The doctor continued, explaining that her blood work had revealed she was HIV positive. For a moment, Maya felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. She blinked, unable to process the words she had just heard. "That can't be right," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "There must be a mistake." The doctor shook his head gently, his tone sympathetic. "We ran the test twice to be certain," he said. "I'm sorry, but the results are conclusive." Maya stared at him, her mind a whirl of disbelief and confusion. She had always been healthy. She had always been careful. The only person she had ever been with was Jarrell. How could this have happened? The doctor began to explain the next steps, treatment options, additional tests, but Maya barely heard him. Her thoughts were spiraling, piecing together fragments of information that didn't make sense. The only way she could have contracted the virus was through Jarrell. And if that was true, it meant Jarrell had been keeping something from her, something that had now altered her life in ways she couldn't even begin to comprehend. When Maya left the clinic that day, the weight of the diagnosis pressed down on her like a crushing force. She sat in her car for what felt like hours, unable to bring herself to start the engine. Tears streamed down her face as she gripped the steering wheel, her mind replaying every moment of the past few months, every time she had felt sick or tired, every moment she had trusted Jarrell without question. The betrayal, though unspoken, was already taking shape in her mind. For the first time in her life, Maya felt truly powerless. Her body, her trust, her future, all of it had been compromised by the one person she had devoted her life to. And as she drove home that evening, the tears turned to anger. Jarrell had come back into her life with promises of love and redemption, but what he had really brought with him was a secret that had shattered the very foundation of their marriage. Maya walked through the door of her home that night, her children greeting her with their usual hugs and smiles. She forced herself to smile back, but the weight of the diagnosis stayed with her, heavy and unrelenting. As she looked around at the life she had fought so hard to build, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. And though she didn't yet know how to confront Jarrell, one thing was certain, the truth could not be ignored. Maya sat at the dining table, the envelope containing her test results resting in front of her like a bomb waiting to go off. She stared at it, her mind was a storm of questions. How could he have done this? How long had he known? Why hadn't he told her? She wanted answers, but she didn't know if she was ready to hear them. When Jarrell walked through the door, his smile faded as soon as he saw her face. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. Maya didn't answer right away. Instead, she slid the envelope across the table toward him. "Read it," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. Jarrell hesitated, glancing at her before picking up the envelope. As his eyes scanned the words on the paper, his expression shifted from confusion to shock, and then to something Maya couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps. Or guilt. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then, Maya spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Explain this to me." Jarrell looked at her, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out. "Explain it." Maya's voice rose, her anger breaking through the fragile calm. "How could this happen? I've been faithful to you. I've waited for you. You're the only one." Jarrell's hands trembled as he set the paper down. "Maya," he began, his voice low and uneven. "It's not what you think." But Maya wasn't ready to hear excuses. "Then tell me what it is," she demanded, her eyes blazing with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. Jarrell finally looked her in the eye, and in that moment, she knew he was about to confess. He took a deep breath. "I didn't think you'd wait for me," he said, the words spilling out in a rush. "I was in prison. It's a different world in there. You don't understand what it's like, what I had to do to survive." Maya stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. "What you had to do?" she repeated, her voice heavy with disbelief. "You're telling me this was survival?" Jarrell tried to explain, his words tumbling over each other. He told her about King, about the arrangement they had, about the compromises he had made. But every word felt like a dagger, cutting deeper into Maya's already shattered heart. "You made a choice," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You chose to lie to me. You chose to bring this into our home." Jarrell reached for her hand, but she pulled away, standing up so quickly that her chair scraped against the floor. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice firm. "You don't get to touch me. Not after this." The weight of his betrayal was suffocating, and Maya felt like she was drowning in a sea of emotions she couldn't control. As the argument escalated, the anger in the room became almost tangible. Maya paced back and forth, her thoughts racing faster than she could keep up with them. Jarrell, still seated at the table, tried to calm her down. "Maya, please," he said. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never meant for any of this to happen." But his words only fueled her rage. "You never meant for this to happen." Maya repeated, her voice rising. You knew, and you didn't tell me. You didn't give me a choice." Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white from the pressure. Jarrell stood up, taking a step toward her. "Maya, I love you. We can get through this." But Maya couldn't hear him. Her mind was consumed by the weight of everything she had lost, her health, her trust, her belief in the life they had built together. In a moment of pure emotion, she turned and walked toward the cabinet where they kept the gun, her movements almost automatic. Jarrell's eyes widened as he realized what she was doing. "Maya, don't," he said, his voice filled with a mix of fear and pleading. Maya picked up the gun, her hands shaking as she turned to face him. "You destroyed me," she said, her voice breaking. "You took everything from me." Jarrell held up his hands, taking a cautious step forward. "Please," he said. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to," but the words never left his lips. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the house, followed by a deafening silence. Jarrell fell to the floor, his body crumpling in on itself as blood pooled beneath him. Maya stood frozen, the gun still in her trembling hands, as the reality of what she had done began to sink in. Maya sat motionless on the floor, her back against the wall, as her eyes remained fixed on Jarrell's lifeless body. She wasn't crying, nor was she panicking. She was simply there, still, quiet, and consumed by the weight of what had just happened. In her hands, she held the framed wedding photo she had retrieved from their mantel moments before. The photo was cracked, the glass splintered from where it had fallen earlier during their argument. Yet the image inside remained intact, a younger Maya and Jarrell, smiling on what was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. It was a painful reminder of what they had once been, of the life she had fought so hard to hold together. Outside, the faint sound of sirens grew louder, their wailing cutting through the night. The neighbors had already gathered on their porches, their expressions ranging from shock to confusion. Many had heard the argument earlier, muffled through the walls of the Thompson home, but no one had anticipated that it would end with the crack of a gunshot. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the windows as the police arrived, their cars pulling up to the curb with an urgency that matched the tension in the air. The officers approached the house cautiously, their hands hovering near their weapons as they knocked on the door. When no one answered, they pushed it open, their movements deliberate and precise. Inside, they found Maya sitting beside Jarrell, her face pale but calm, as if the enormity of what had happened hadn't fully registered yet. The gun lay on the floor a few feet away, untouched since she had dropped it. One of the officers crouched beside her, speaking softly. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his tone gentle but firm. Maya didn't respond. She simply stared ahead, her hands gripping the photo tightly. The officer tried again. "Ma'am, we need to ask you to stand up. Can you do that for us?" Slowly, almost mechanically, Maya nodded. She placed the photo carefully on the floor before allowing the officers to help her to her feet. As they handcuffed her, Maya didn't resist. She didn't speak. She didn't even look at the officers. Her gaze remained fixed on the ground, her expression unreadable. The neighbors watched from the street as she was led out of the house, their whispers barely audible over the hum of the police radios. For many of them, Maya had always been a pillar of strength, a devoted mother who had weathered more storms than most could imagine. To see her like this, broken and silent, was almost incomprehensible. Inside the house, the forensic team worked methodically. They photographed the scene from every angle, collecting evidence that would later become crucial in the trial. The gun was bagged and tagged, its presence a stark reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. Blood pooled around Jarrell's body, a visceral image that would haunt those who saw it. The framed wedding photo, still resting on the floor where Maya had placed it, was also collected, its cracked glass and preserved smiles telling a story of love turned to heartbreak. Maya's trial began weeks later, the courtroom filled with reporters, neighbors, and those who had followed the case from the beginning. The story of a devoted wife-turned-killer had captivated the community, sparking debates about loyalty, betrayal, and justice. Maya sat at the defense table, her hands folded in her lap as the proceedings unfolded around her. Her face was a mask of calm, but the toll of everything she had endured was evident in her weary eyes. The prosecution wasted no time building their case. They argued that Maya's actions were deliberate, pointing to the fact that she had sent her children to a neighbor's house before confronting Jarrell. This was not a crime of passion, the prosecutor declared. This was premeditation. Maya Thompson knew exactly what she was going to do that night. They emphasized the moments leading up to the shooting, painting a picture of a woman who had planned her actions with cold calculation. The defense, however, told a very different story. Maya's attorney, a seasoned litigator with a calm yet commanding presence, began by addressing the jury directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not the story of a cold-blooded killer," he said. "This is the story of a woman who gave everything for her family, her time, her health, her very soul, and was met with betrayal so profound that it broke her." He detailed Maya's years of sacrifice, her unwavering loyalty to Jarrell, and the devastating moment when she discovered her diagnosis. The trial was emotional from start to finish. Friends of Maya testified about her character, describing her as a selfless mother and a devoted wife who had always put her family first. "She was the kind of person who would give you the shirt off her back," one friend said, her voice trembling. "She loved Jarrell with everything she had. I don't think anyone can understand what she was going through unless they've lived it themselves." The most heart-wrenching testimony came from Maya's eldest son, Zion. Now a young man, he took the stand with visible hesitation, his hands gripping the edges of the witness stand. "My mom isn't a bad person," he said, his voice shaking. "She raised us with love. She taught us to be strong, even when things were hard. I don't know everything that happened, but I know she didn't want this. I know she didn't mean for it to end like this." His words brought tears to the eyes of many in the courtroom, even those who had remained impartial until that moment. The prosecution countered with a relentless focus on the evidence. They presented the gun, the timeline, and Maya's own statements to the police, framing them as proof of intent. They argued that, no matter how difficult her circumstances had been, Maya had made a choice that ended Jarrell's life. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with their decision. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the verdict, guilty of manslaughter. Maya remained composed as the sentence was announced, 20 years in prison. There were no gasps, no outbursts, just the quiet hum of whispered reactions from those in attendance. Some saw the sentence as justice served, while others viewed it as a tragic end to an already devastating story. As the judge addressed Maya, he acknowledged the complexities of the case. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his tone measured, "it is clear that you have endured great hardship. However, the law is the law, and actions have consequences. It is my hope that this sentence will allow you time to reflect and to heal." Maya was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her steps slow but steady. As she passed by the gallery, she glanced toward her children, who sat with a relative in the front row. Zion met her eyes, his face streaked with tears. She gave him a faint, reassuring smile, a silent promise that, despite everything, she would always be their mother. And then she was gone, escorted out of the room and into the next chapter of her life. The aftermath of the trial left the community grappling with difficult questions. Could Maya's actions be justified by the depth of her pain? Was she a victim of betrayal, or had she crossed a line that could never be excused? What do you think? Tell us in the comments section. For her children, the loss was immeasurable. They had lost their father to his choices and their mother to hers, leaving them to navigate a world forever changed by the events of that night. The story of Maya and Jarrell Thompson is not just about the tragedy that unfolded within the walls of their home, it's about the complex web of emotions, decisions, and consequences that led them to that moment. At its core, this is a story about love, love that endured unimaginable trials, love that was tested by betrayal, and love that ultimately crumbled under the weight of unspoken truths. Maya's unwavering loyalty and sacrifices were the foundation of her family, but even the strongest foundations can crack when burdened with too much. She bore the weight of her husband's absence, raising their children alone and holding on to hope for over a decade. Yet, when that hope was met with betrayal, it shattered something within her, a wound too deep to heal. Jarrell's choices in prison were born out of desperation, but desperation does not absolve responsibility. He entered a world where survival came at a cost, and in his attempt to protect himself, he made decisions that would ripple far beyond the confines of his cell. His silence, his inability to face the truth head-on, and his failure to give Maya the honesty she deserved were choices that carried devastating consequences. At the heart of this tragedy lies the fragility of trust. Relationships are built on a delicate balance, one that requires honesty, understanding, and forgiveness. But when that balance is broken, when secrets replace transparency and betrayal replaces loyalty, the results can be catastrophic. Maya and Jarrell's story serves as a stark reminder of how quickly love can turn to pain when trust is eroded. As we reflect on the events that led to this heartbreaking conclusion, it's impossible not to ask ourselves some difficult questions. Could Maya have handled this differently? Was there a moment when she could have chosen another path, one that didn't end in tragedy? And if you were in her position, carrying the weight of betrayal and heartbreak, what would you have done? And what about Jarrell? His choices in prison were shaped by a harsh reality, but were they justified? Could he have made different decisions to ensure that his return to his family was one of healing instead of destruction? Or was he simply a man caught in circumstances beyond his control, doing what he thought was necessary to survive? This story challenges us to think deeply about the complexities of human relationships and the consequences of our actions. It asks us to consider the line between survival and betrayal, between loyalty and self-preservation. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about what we're capable of when faced with unimaginable circumstances. Maya and Jarrell's story is one that lingers long after the final chapter has closed. It's a story that invites reflection, discussion, and, perhaps, a better understanding of the human condition. If this story moved you, if it left you questioning the choices and actions of its characters, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Could Maya have found another way? Were Jarrell's choices excusable, or could he have done better? Your voice matters, and we want to know what you think. And if you found this story compelling, don't forget to like this video and share it with others who might connect with its themes. Subscribe to our channel for more intense and thought-provoking stories that explore the depths of the human experience. Together, let's continue to uncover the stories that challenge us, move us, and remind us of the fragile balance between love, trust, and betrayal. Thank you for watching, and remember, every story has lessons to teach us, if we're willing to listen.